Vacations are fun, aren't they? The world is essentially your oyster. You could go anywhere you want, anytime you want, for as long as you have the resources to do so. On the other hand, unfortunate events can inevitably occur as well. What if, on one of your future vacations, you were to become stranded on an island? What if there were only a handful of you, and you'll be the only one left alive after a couple weeks? With no rescue in sight, no other food to consume, would you cannibalize someone to survive on a stranded island, knowing that there's a 25% chance of rescue survival if you eat the corpse, but a guaranteed death if you don't? To begin with, there are no binding legal implications of performing cannibalism in the United States. With the exception of the state of Idaho, the UK, most of Europe, Japan, and many other places in the world. There are, however, a number of laws in place across America that indirectly make it impossible to legally obtain and consume body matter. The same can be said for the many other countries in which cannibalism isn't directly illegal. All that said, if a person was mindful of all these laws and managed to obtain some human flesh legally, they could quite literally eat human flesh and suffer no legal consequences if a situation that calls for cannibalism may arise. Like, for example, for the sake of survival when trapped on an island. In any event, the fact that there's no direct law against cannibalism in most of the world means courts often have to wrestle with whether a given act of cannibalism should be prosecuted for violating another passed and billed law. One of the most notorious examples of this was the case of Armin Meiwes, a German man who infamously posted an ad on a cannibalism fetish website to find someone who'd allow him to eat them. Armin got a surprising number of responses from people perfectly willing at first, but all backed out when it came time to do the deed. Important to arguments later made in the court battle, Armin did not pressure any of them to go through with the act. Eventually, Armin ultimately found a willing individual, a 43-year-old computer repairman called Bernard Jürgen Brandis. Plans were made and the pair eventually met. They reached a conclusion where Brandis would offer his genitalia for Armin to consume, with the initial intent for the latter to bite it off. But this didn't work out, as apparently this is harder than movies sometimes imply to do. So they had to sever it instead. Brandis eventually passed out from blood loss, and Meiwes proceeded to carve him up, with the whole thing captured on video, which was also key in showing Brandis was not only willing, but quite eager to be killed. And at no point did Meiwes pressure him into anything. Over time, Meiwes ate approximately 20 kilograms of Brandis before police caught on to what he'd done when he posted another ad online looking for another willing participant in his self-reported sexual fetish. The horrific nature of these acts naturally led to something of a media sensation over the case. But as cannibalism isn't illegal in Germany, and Meiwes' victim wanted to be killed and was fine with being eaten, the court battle raged for some time before it was finally decided that Armin should be convicted of manslaughter and given an 8-year prison sentence. This ruling was later overturned, and he was convicted of murder and given a life sentence. To wrap up this disturbing tale, it's noted that today, Meiwes is a vegetarian and strongly counsels anyone with a similar fetish to seek professional help to stop things from escalating as it had with him. But what about survival situations? The most famous example of this from a legal perspective is arguably that of Regina versus Dudley and Stephens, a landmark case that involved the murder and cannibalization of a young cabin boy after a ship called the Mignonette was destroyed by a storm. For anyone unfamiliar with the case, in 1884, 3 sailors called Tom Dudley, Edwin Stephens, and Ned Brooks, and their cabin boy Richard Parker were lost at sea after a wave destroyed their ship. Cast adrift with only a few pounds of turnips for sustenance, Dudley and Stephens eventually made the grisly decision to kill and eat Parker. Brooks played no part in the murder, but would later admit to consuming Parker's flesh and drinking his blood to survive. Upon being rescued by a passing ship, Dudley and Stephens immediately confessed to killing Parker. The two men defended their decision by saying that Parker had become violently ill after consuming salt water and was at death's door anyway. Both sailors argued that killing Parker was morally justified to necessitate their own survival, citing the custom of the sea, which had seen many a marooned sailor drawing lots and eating one another to survive, generally with no consequences to themselves after the fact, so long as the lottery of who should be killed was deemed to have been fairly implemented. The thing is though, nobody aboard the Mignonette had drawn lots. Stephen and Dudley even admitted that they'd held Parker down as they slit his throat to stop him struggling. The British courts disagreed that killing Parker was necessary, as there was no way for the men to know that a ship wasn't about to crest the horizon and rescue them. And the fact that they needed to physically restrain Parker seemingly meant he couldn't have been that close to death. On that note, a judge would later argue that to justify Parker's murder as a necessity, each man would have had to have been on the very precipice of death. It's also worth noting that in previous cases where sailors had cited the custom of the sea, after being marooned and drawing lots to justify murdering and eating members of their own crew, cabin boys, slaves, and other people of low rank, disproportionately found themselves drawing the short straw. This led to people calling into question whether these lotteries were actually fairly implemented, as the survivors invariably claimed, partially spurring the courts to finally set a legal precedent for how to proceed in similar cases, in effect making an example of Stephens and Dudley. Thus, a decision was made to try each man for murder, which was a capital offense at the time. The problem was, the public was largely on the side of Dudley and Stephens, and a jury seemed initially reluctant to condemn the men to death for doing something to survive in a desperate situation. As for Brooks, he wasn't convicted of any crime, and was largely let off despite readily admitting to consuming Parker as well. The key distinction here was that he didn't take part in the actual murder in any way. As for the other two, they were initially convicted of murder and sentenced to death, but in part due to public pressure, their sentences were later commuted to 6 months in prison. But the case did set a legal precedent that there is no defense of necessity for the crime of murder in cases like this. And it's now well established in law that the killing of another human being to aid your own survival by consuming their flesh can never be justified in a legal sense. But again, eating an already dead person in the same type of situation is perfectly legal in most countries. Of course, the law is one thing. It's a whole different thing to wrestle with the moral aspect of the act. For example, there is a case of the now infamous Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 crash of 1972, which saw survivors cutting and eating strips of flesh of dead passengers to survive. Despite initial religious reservations from most on board, every survivor eventually gave into the hunger, which speaks to the power starvation has to test the very limits of a person's personal morality. As survivor Roberto Canessa later noted, our common goal was to survive, but what we lacked was food. We had long since run out of the meager pickings we'd found on the plane, and there was no vegetation or animal life to be found. After just a few days, we were feeling the sensation of our own bodies consuming themselves just to remain alive. Before long, we would become too weak to recover from starvation. We knew the answer, but it was too terrible to contemplate. The bodies of our friends and teammates, preserved outside in the snow and ice, contained vital, life-giving protein that could help us survive. But could we do it? For a long time we agonized. I went out in the snow and prayed to God for guidance. Without his consent, I felt I would be violating the memory of my friends, that I would be stealing their souls. We wondered whether we would be going mad even to contemplate such a thing. Had we turned into brute savages, or was this the only sane thing to do? But, to sum up, people who find themselves in an impossibly dire situation and resort to the cannibalization of the dead are almost universally considered not guilty of any crime, as far as the law in most countries is concerned. On top of that, even in non-survival situations, if you can manage to obtain the flesh of another human legally, you're likely also going to get off scot-free if you eat it, even publicly. This fact has been particularly beneficial in recent times, with the fad of people eating the placenta after a woman gives birth, including at times when their partner or family members might partake. which most consider technically a form of cannibalism. Although, where one draws the line with regards to when consuming a specific bit of another human's flesh is cannibalism or not is hotly debated. And if you search around enough, you'll inevitably find many a mildly humorous heated argument over whether swallowing human sperm counts as cannibalism, and it's technically flesh, of a sort. And even in the state of Idaho in the United States, where cannibalism is explicitly illegal and eating the placenta, by the wording of their law, is most definitely an act of cannibalism, it's generally thought by various legal minds who've chimed in on this one that if any prosecutor actually tried to prosecute in this case, or other non-harmful forms of cannibalism in Idaho, which could result in up to a 14-year prison sentence for the convicted, that the law in question would probably ultimately be deemed unconstitutional after a whole lot of legal wrangling. What do you think? What would you do personally if you were in the shoes of these men? Would you cannibalize someone for the sake of survival? Or would you rather perish and uphold your moral standards?